Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. So we do a lot of talking on the show about philosophy, and I like to have different perspectives on rather than just have the show be an echo chamber. So I like to get guests to come on and talk different perspectives. And today's guest is here to do just that. He's a utilitarian. He's a blogger known as Bentham's Bulldog from Bentham's newsletter. Matthew Adelstein, or is it Stein? I'm sorry. I should have asked ahead of time.
Yeah, it's Stein.
All right, Matthew
So you pronounced it
Adelstein.
right.
All right, beautiful. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Matthew, you're only 19 years old, right? Now, when I
That's
was
true.
19 years old, I was getting drunk and getting into fights and doing all kinds of things I couldn't do. So, you're way ahead of where I was for sure. So, how long have you been interested in philosophy and what attracted you to it?
So I've been at least kind of nominally interested in philosophy for like maybe a decade or so. I mean, like, when I was very young, when I was maybe 10 or something, I would like watch atheist YouTube videos, and I found those to be a lot of fun. But in terms of getting like seriously into philosophy, it becoming kind of my main interest, that happened around 10th grade. And the thing that actually launched it was, so I was having an argument with a friend, and he thought that morality was not objective, and I thought that morality was objective. And I wanted to win the argument with him, and I kept losing because he was very smart. And so I sort of went home and I read a lot of, and I read the book On What Matters, which is kind of a very dense philosophical tome. And that is what sort of sparked my love of philosophy.
At 15?
16 or
Oh,
so.
okay. Much older than 15 then. All right.
Yeah.
So you're a utilitarian, specifically an hedonic act utilitarian. What does that mean?
So a utilitarian thinks that the thing that determines what acts you should do is is the consequences of the acts. So it doesn't matter kind of the intent or other things like that. It just matters whether the state of affairs, if you're deciding between acts and one of the acts will bring about a better world, then you should take that act rather than the one that will bring about a worse world. And then, okay, so then the question is, how do we judge worlds? Well, utilitarianism says the way you judge worlds is you look at how good people's lives are, and you just kind of add up how good everyone's life is to determine how good the world is. So the goodness of the world is a function of the aggregate goodness of sentient beings' lives. And then the question is, okay, what makes your life go well? What does it mean to have a good life? Yeah. And then that's where the hedonic answer comes in, which is, I think that to have a good life, how good your life is for you is determined by how happy you are minus how much suffering you have. And then in terms of the act bit, so lots of people are what are called rule utilitarians, where they think that what determines what actions you should take is not what actions have the best outcomes, but instead you should follow the rules, where if people generally follow them, those will have the best outcomes. Now, I think that you should just take the actions with the best outcomes rather than following the rules that if everyone followed them, will have the best outcomes. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't, rely on rules. It turns out that you'll just do more good if you're relying on kind of like if you're relying on moral rules, if you're kind of not thinking through things at a very granular level each time you make a decision. But the idea is that what we care about is not following the best rules, but instead doing the best actions.
Okay. And you include non-human conscious animals also, right? So like the pleasure and pain of dogs, cats, tigers, that all matters also into the equation, right?
Yes, I do. And I think that this is actually sort of common sense. I mean, most people think, for example, that it would be wrong to kick a dog or to beat a dog because dogs matter, at least to some degree. It seems like if beings can suffer, if their lives can go well or poorly, then we should take them into account. And then just one other thing to be said for that is, one test of whether a being would matter is let's imagine you slowly turned into that being. After you were that being, would you care what happened to you? Well, if I slowly turn into a rock, I would not care what happened to me after I was a rock, because, rocks, they're not conscious, they can't have any experience. But if I would slowly, over the course of 10 years, gradually morph into a pig, I would care an awful lot about the pig not being tortured. And so this shows that pig matters. If you would rationally care about yourself after undergoing some change to being some kind of entity, then that entity matters morally. Because if it didn't matter morally, you would have no reason to care about it. And so if you do have a reason to care about it, then it has to.
Is there a general epistemological view associated with utilitarianism? In other words, if you're a utilitarian, would you necessarily be a direct realist or a nominalist? Or can you be any one of those things and still be a utilitarian?
You could be any one of those things and still be a utilitarian. There's no associated epistemology that necessarily comes with utilitarianism. I mean, I can tell you about my epistemology, and it's actually very similar to that of Michael Huemer, who I know you interviewed recently.
Yeah, please do.
Oh yeah, so I'm a phenomenal conservative. I think that the way that we get evidence for things is through seemings, through intellectual appearances. So we sort of have rational faculties. We can think through things, and things can appear the case. So when I think about what pain is like, it seems to me that pain is bad. Okay, and then that makes it so that I should, in the absence of any other arguments, I should think that pain is bad. If something seems really obvious, then all else equal, you should think that it's the case. And so then the question, and then I think that utilitarianism ends up being ultimately the most intuitive moral theory, even though there are often some cases where it initially diverges from our intuitions. I think that when we dig deeper and really reflect, it actually ends up being the most in accord with our intuition. So I'll give you kind of a simple example. There's a famous thought experiment called the repugnant conclusion, and the idea is like, okay, imagine two worlds. One of the worlds has 10 billion people living really happy lives, just having a great time. And the other world just contains a huge number of people with barely worthwhile lives. Their lives are just barely above the baseline. And so the question is, okay, which of these is a better world? Now, utilitarianism would say, at least if it's of the totalist variety, if you just add up, there are different ways of doing the moral mathematics, but the way I accept is that it would say that the world with a sufficiently large number of people with barely worthwhile lives, that's a better world. And the reason that that's a better world is that it has more total utility, because if each of them has positive utility, if there are enough of them, then that will have higher total utility. Now, lots of people say, oh, this is so unintuitive. It's horrific. It's very repugnant. It got the label, the repugnant conclusion. But then it turned out that actually it's really hard to avoid the repugnant conclusion, and you have to say things that are even weirder. So let me just give you two brief arguments for accepting the repugnant conclusion. There are a lot more, but these are two just to kind of get the point. So the first one is, you can derive the repugnant conclusion from the following three premises. The first one is transitivity, which says that if A is better than B and B is better than C, then A has to be better than C. The second one is, I forget the name of it, but the idea is if you make everyone better off and then add new people who have lives that are positive, then that makes things better, given that everyone's better off. The people who have positive lives, they're better off, they're happy to exist, and the people you made better off, they're better off. Okay, so that seems right. And then the third is, if you're comparing two worlds in terms of utility, one of them has a higher average utility, a higher total utility, more equal distribution of utility, then that world is better from the standpoint of utility. Well, you might, why is it that these three premises require we accept the repugnant conclusion? Each of these premises are pretty obvious intuitively. Well, so let's say you start with a world with 10 billion people with great lives. Now let's say, okay, make each of their lives slightly better and then add a bunch of people with, slightly worthwhile lives. Okay, that's an improvement as per the first principle. And then compare that to a world where you have the same number of people, but each of them have twice as much utility as the people with barely worthwhile lives. And then you compare that to the second world. Well, that world has higher average utility, higher total utility, more equal distribution of utility. So that's a better world. And so as a result, by transitivity, it would be better than the first world. Okay, so that's one argument. The other argument is that, so let's say you start with 10 billion people living great lives. Let's imagine you just make their lives slightly worse and then make there be way more of them. That seems like an improvement. We'll do that again, make their lives slightly worse and make there be way more of them. That seems like an improvement. Like if you replace one person with just a slightly less good life, where there are 100 times as many people, that seems like an improvement, but you keep doing that until you get to a bunch of people with barely worthwhile lives. And so, yeah, so the basic idea is just that when we really carefully reflect about the allegedly unintuitive implications of utilitarianism, they end up being intuitive. I've sort of argued this kind of at length on my blog, which Bentham, you can find at benthams.substack.com. Yeah, gotta do the marketing.
Hey, I'm a capitalist. You're not going to get any argument out of me.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's sort of the basic idea.
Okay. So I want to back up just a little bit to the epistemology that you mentioned, right? Because you mentioned pain and you said pain seems bad. When I think of pain, pain is bad by definition. It's almost axiomatic, or probably is axiomatic, that pain is not a good thing. But if you were to try to derive more far-reaching conclusions, not about ethics, I'm talking about just about knowledge in general. For instance, if you were to say, well, water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, or water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, how do you learn that? Because that's not something that can just be intuited. Well, at least I don't
Yeah,
believe it
well,
can be intuited.
yeah, well, so when we're talking about intuitions, we're talking about intellectual appearances. So, and intellectual appearances can be based on evidence. So if you see every time, like you put water at a certain temperature, and then you see that it always boils at that temperature, well, then it seems that that's the boiling point of water. Okay, maybe there's some vast alien conspiracy where they're actually just causing it to dissipate into something where such that that's not actually its boiling point. But when you reflect, that seems like the best explanation of the evidence, which is why you should accept it. And so it's just like, when like phenomenal conservatism is just like, think about things and believe the more obvious things rather than the less obvious things. And so, okay, you do an experiment, and then it seems really obvious that, based on the experiment where you subject water to a bunch of conditions and it always boils at a particular temperature, then it seems really obvious that that means that that's its boiling point, so you accept that that's its boiling point.
See, so phenomenal conservative, because I've never heard that term before, but I'm going to take a crack at it. Phenomenal conservatives I'm going to take the phenomenal as stemming from Immanuel Kant's phenomenal world, the phenomena, the world of appearances. So I'm going to think that conservatism applies to, you're not going to go out on limbs speculating about these appearances. All things remaining equal, you're going to assume that appearances are correct. And that would be conservative.
Yeah, that's basically right. The idea is just that you should, like, it's like conserve the way things appear. So the way that things appear to you, you should, in the absence of good reason to distrust that, you should assume that they are in fact that way.
Okay. So that definition that you gave of intuition is counter to the way I normally interpret intuition. It runs counter to the way the dictionary defines intuition, and I think counter to the way most people think of it. Doesn't mean you can't use it in that way. I'm just saying that it's not how I would normally think of it. I normally think of intuition as sort of a non-sensory means of knowledge, that it's not being processed by reason. It's not being experienced by the senses. I just know somehow. So when you say that epistemologically you're an intuitionist, basically, that's what I would think, but that's not what you mean by the term.
Yeah, well, I don't know. So, I mean, the way I'm using intuition is basically exactly the way that the ethical intuitionists and the people who defend phenomenal conservatism use the term. Now, I mean, I agree that the term intuition in philosophy has a slightly different meaning from what the term usually means. I mean, very often people will use intuition to refer to almost a quasi-magical apparatus by which they, like, I have, I have good intuition that she's a Capricorn or something. People will often use it that way. But yeah, no, so I agree. I'm not using exactly the standard English definition, but I think I'm using the standard philosophical definition.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I just wanted so the listener understands clearly that you're using it in a different way. People frequently do that, and as long as you state how you're using it, I have no issue with it. You know what I mean? That just seems fine to me. And it seems like that's basically the solution that you're recommending to, say, the Hume's problem of induction is where he says just because something follows, it doesn't, all you can say is it follows doesn't mean it's caused. You're saying that, well, if this happens over and over again, it seems to me that it's causing it, so I'm going to accept it as it's causing it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there are other ways out of Hume's problem of induction that I could go into a little bit, that they get sort of complicated. But yeah, I mean, so like ideally, I mean, if it just seems the case that something is the case, that's an okay argument for accepting it. But it's also helpful if we have an explanation of why it's the case. So like, it seems like I should trust my senses, but it seems, it also seems good, like if we have an explanation of why I'm probably not in a brain in a vat, that's kind of useful.
So it goes beyond the intuitions. It ultimately relies on some sort of rational explanation.
Well, it doesn't rely on some sort of rational explanation. Like, I mean, I think, the reason I believe pain is bad is not because I have some like well worked out argument for why pain is bad. It's because I feel pain and I think this is bad.
Yeah, but that's different. That's more like ostensive or axiomatic. Pain is not a good thing. I mean, that's what it is. I'm talking about like the thing we talked about in relation to the water boiling or water freezing. If you want to understand why, or if you want to understand why, for instance, if a bike hits an automobile, the bike is what goes flying. And then that requires you to reason through the velocity, weight, the types of materials that are involved, density, mass, all those sort of things. That would be rational. That wouldn't just be a seeming where, oh, it seems true to me. That would require more detail. Would you agree?
Well, right. I mean, yeah, so there are some areas where, just if you claim to have a seeming about them, like if you claim that it just seems to you that water's boiling point is like 78 degrees in the absence of
Yes.
any evidence, I mean, I think you're either like lying or like mentally ill or something. Like I mean, maybe, I just don't understand what it would mean for it to like appear on an intellectual level like water's boiling point is 78 degrees. And so what we do is, given that we don't have the direct intuitions about that, we gather evidence about it. And
Yes.
then once we gather the evidence, we think, okay, it seems like, given that water always boils when it's this temperature, it seems like water's boiling point is this number of degrees.
Okay. So beyond just knowing what hedonic act utilitarianism is, you believe that this is true, right? That the theory is an accurate representation of reality. It's not just an opinion, right? So this
That's
is
right.
the correct moral theory. Okay, why do you believe it's the correct moral theory?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. So, I mean, we sort of have to take, so like, so I mean, we can, there are sort of multiple steps. I mean, so one reason I think it's true is that I think like whenever we carefully reflect on the case on particular cases where it gives judgments that diverge from the judgments of other theories, when we really carefully reflect, it always turns out to be right. And then I think that there are pretty good arguments of why we should be utilitarians from first principles. So, an example of an argument is the following. So, morality describes what we have impartial reason to do. So if the only reason you think you have to like, it's describing, yeah, morality describes what you have impartial reason to do. So it's talking about a different type of thing from your self-interested
Hold
reasons.
on, I did you say it's an impartial or a partial?
Impartial.
Oh, okay, okay. I just wanted to
Yeah.
make
So
sure I heard
morality
you correctly.
describes what you have an impartial reason to do. Uh, And so, okay, what do you have impartial reason to do? Well, here's an account of what you have impartial reason to do. You have impartial reason to do what you would do if you cared about everyone equally. Well, okay, so then how do you care about everyone equally? Well, I mean, so the way you care about everyone equally is you value everyone's interest equally, and so you value what goes well for you just as much as you'd value what goes well for other people. And so if we accept that morality is about impartial reasons, then you get this idea that you should take everyone's interest into account equally, and then that's basically utilitarianism. The arguments for hedonism are, I mean, I could go into them. Some of them get a bit more complicated, but I mean, one basic one is that hedonism seems like the only way to account for the intuition that if you have a life where you're horrifically miserable all the time, that can't be a very good life. So let's imagine you think that there's lots of things that makes your life go well. Maybe knowledge is part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe having lots of friends is. Let's imagine you had a lot of friends, you had a lot of knowledge, but you were really, really miserable. Every moment of every day was worse than the worst torture. Well, if you think that there are things other than pleasure that make your life go well, other than pleasure and pain, then that could be a very good life. If, as long as we just raise the values of the other things to a sufficient degree, then that could be a very good life. But that doesn't seem like a very good life. Now, there are various ways to try to get around that, but I think all of them have their own problems. A final kind of argument for utilitarianism is that, so I think you can show that if we adopt roles as veil of ignorance, which does sort of seem intuitively to capture the spirit of morality, where you treat where you act as you would if you didn't know who you were. So if you're deciding to punch someone, you would say, well, I wouldn't punch that person because if I had a 50% chance of being the one who was punched, I wouldn't want to do that. So if we accept kind of roles veil of ignorance, you can show that if we accept certain other basic assumptions, like if something is better for everyone, an expectation that we should do it, completeness, continuity, transitivity, and a few other kind of trivial axioms, that we would be utilitarians from behind the veil of ignorance. And it seems intuitively like the veil of ignorance captures what the essence of morality.
Okay, so the first point I want to make is this. You initially defined moral action as being impartial, right? But that tilts the scale. Right off the bat, you're preempting the discussion and you're saying that morality has to be impartial, which I think is something that has to be proved, not postulated. The next thing you said is if you care about everybody equally. But there's no reason I should care about everybody equally. You haven't demonstrated that. That assumes a form of altruism. So how do you demonstrate that morality requires impartiality? There's certainly nothing within the concept. I mean, and not all moralists have been said that you have to be impartial. Why would my actions have to be impartial? That's the thing in question. That's the first point that you'd have to prove.
Yeah. So, so in terms of the point about partiality, I mean, I'm using a kind of broad definition of partiality that includes that would include that would include versions of ethical egoism. So if you think that if people were acting perfectly morally, that they would still be ethical egoists, that it's not just like, egoism, like if a person's not just describing their own code of conduct, but they're describing the way that they think people really ought to act, then I think that's impartial in the relevant sense. But I think that the reason why morality has to be impartial is that I think one, it's contained within the concept, and two, that partial moral theories are wrong. So, consider the following example. Suppose that you could save 10 billion people from the most horrific torture, but doing so would be a slight net personal cost. So maybe you would feel good about saving the lives of 10 billion people from torture, but so however good you would feel, then you would get rewarded by slightly more than that if you didn't save their life. Well, it still seems really obvious that you should save their life, even if it would be bad for you. So
but that's a conclusion. That's an end conclusion. What I'm looking for you to get. I want to know why these are the correct conclusions. Because just to tell me, well, it would seem like this is, and I'm not disagreeing with the conclusion that you just put out there. What I'm saying is it's not validated just by stating it and saying, well, some people think it. Because if I grew up in a Jewish community, for instance, all my life I've been told since I was knee-high to a grasshopper that eating pork is wrong, then my intuition is going to be that eating pork is wrong. But the only standard I have to validate that is the Torah, which then you'd have to prove the accuracy of the Torah. In order to say that that conclusion is correct, the Torah has to be correct. But you're just listing a conclusion. You're not justifying that conclusion. You're not justifying impartiality. I think it might help. What is the purpose, in your view? Purpose and definition of morality. What is morality? What is its purpose?
So I think morality describes, so in terms of its purpose, it is objectively the case that you should do the right thing. So the purpose of morality is to increase the odds that you do what you objectively should do. In terms of the definition, words like this are kind of notoriously difficult to define, but I think morality denotes a system that determines what you have most reason to do.
If I took Ayn Rand's definition of morality and I said morality is a code of conduct, would that be a code of values? Would that be okay? Would that suffice? If I said morality is a code of values to guide your conduct and in your everyday living.
Sort of. So I think that doesn't capture part of what morality is about. Morality, it should inform us about axiology. So, we should, any acceptable moral view will say that tornadoes are bad, even if that, that doesn't guide our conduct.
Well, hold on. Let me pause. I want you to continue the thought, but I don't want you to get too far ahead of me and then I can't keep up. Right. So a tornado has no moral significance in my view, because the only things that have moral significance, a tornado is bad in that it's unpleasant. but it has no moral significance because it's not a conscious actor. It's not choosing to act. It just is. It's just something that confronts me in my daily. Now, how I react to it might have moral significance, but the tornado in and of itself has no moral significance in that sense of the term bad.
Yeah, well, this will depend on exactly what we mean by the term bad. So if bad, or sorry, it'll depend on what we mean by it. So if by morality we're just referring to like what is right and wrong to do, then then I think if morality, well, there's still maybe going to be some problems with the definition, but then then tornadoes are not going, tornadoes are obviously not immoral, but they are bad. But so, okay, if we agree that they're bad, then, but I think that's going to be sort of broadly part of the moral picture, even if you are not going to say that that's what morality directly is, because that doesn't describe a code of conduct. If morality describes a code of conduct, I mean, I don't think that that's all that morality describes. Like, I think morality also describes not just what the way you should act, but what you should care about, I think. So like, you should care about, well-being and stuff, right? Like it also describes the things that are worth caring about. But that definition I think is close enough to being right to be kind of serviceable.
And I would say, Matthew, that even what you just said, caring, the purpose of caring about things is so that you can act toward them, so you can take action. To just care about something and not be able to do anything about it just defeats the entire purpose of caring.
Well,
it's not to say you can never care about something you can't do something about. I'm just saying that caring is a motive force, right? If I care about Matthew's well-being, I'm going to take action to whatever extent I can to help him out, right? To make his life more pleasurable. Otherwise, the caring, I can just sit in my room and say I care about all kinds of things and not do anything. Then the caring is purposeless.
Yeah, I don't think that's true, that caring is only about guiding conduct in the right way. So, I mean, consider two moral agents. Both of them do exactly the same thing. Both of them give 10% of their income to charity. But one of them hopes for as many bad things to happen as possible. Every time he hears a story on the news about a tornado killing lots of people, he thinks, wow, this is a great thing. They act in exactly the same ways, but one of them just has these really vile dispositions where he wants as horrible things to happen. He hopes for people to be raped, tortured, and murdered.
Sure.
And so then the question is, okay, which of these is a better person? Well, I think that even if they act the same way, like that these are not morally identical people. That that morality should also assess what things are worth caring about.
Oh, I agree. All I'm saying is that caring has to do with action. I'm not saying whatever somebody happens to care about makes it a good thing. I was a criminal. I cared about all kinds of horrible things. But nonetheless, what I cared about motivated me to act. It wasn't I just cared for the sake of caring.
Well, but I think even if it doesn't motivate you to act, things that you value can still be improper. Like, like I think that if you value torture and murder, even if you don't act to bring about torture and murder, that is a moral defect.
But how could I value something and not do anything to achieve it?
Well, there are lots of things I value.
Yeah, like what?
Well, I mean, there are lots of things that I value that I do nothing to achieve. I mean, like all else equal, I would value for you to, have a nice life. All else equal, I would value you having eating a nice cake over you not eating a nice cake because you would enjoy it, and I think people being happy is good. But I'm not currently doing anything to I'm not currently shipping you a cake.
But all things aren't equal. In reality, all things are not equal. Reality is what it is. And a person's values, the way I would assess what a person values is how they act. So for instance, if I'm teaching, I used to run a lot of programs in prison, rehabilitation programs. So a guy comes in and he's sitting in front of me and he says, you know what? The things I value in life are education, work, my kids' well-being, and my parents, right? Okay, well, what do you do about any of those things? Well, what I do is I watch Jerry Springer every day. I play cards and I play dominoes. Okay, well, then what you're claiming to value is not what you actually value, because you're not trying to be a better father. You're not calling your child. You're not trying to arrange to spend time with them when you get out. You're not doing the things to make yourself a better person so that you can stay out. So your claims are irrelevant. I can claim to value all kinds of things, but if I'm not doing anything about them, it's hard for me to see, one, how would you even know that another person valued that? And what does value mean at that point?
Well, so how we would know it is an epistemological question.
That's a
And I
different question.
agree.
I agree.
Yeah, and I agree that it'll often actually be kind of difficult to know what people value if they don't act. But there can be moral assessments even if no one can ever know about it. So if I covertly killed someone behind a dumpster, even if I was so covert that no one could ever find out,
Sure.
their morality would still have something to say about that. And so in a similar way, if a person has bad dispositions, morality can still say something about that.
I
Now, in
agree
terms of
with
the
that.
prison exam, yeah, no, I mean, in terms of the prison example, I think that it is true that the way people act is a very good way of figuring out what their dispositions are. But my claim is even if people act in perfectly okay ways, they are still not morally optimal if they have the wrong sets of dispositions.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying
Right.
that the thing that I'm saying is that what a person values, that values are guides to action. They're not just sort of static things that we just happen to have. They're motivating forces. Well,
Values often have the
I guess I
values
should
often
ask
have
you.
the
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
wait, sorry, can I? Yeah, values
Yeah, I'm
often have the
sorry.
effect of guiding action, but values are not the same as guides to action because you can have a value that does not guide your action at all. I mean, I'm opposed to famine in Mongolia, but I'm currently doing nothing to show how opposed I am to famine in
Mm-hmm.
Mongolia. There are lots of cases where you value something and that does not affect your actions at all.
So, how would you define value then?
Well, I mean, so we need to just. So I think value, simpliciter value describes the things that are worth caring about. That like a person's values describe the things that they do in fact care about.
Right.
We need to distinguish value, what is valuable from what a
In
person
what people
values. You
value.
might value the wrong
I
thing.
agree with you 100%. So, in this context, you're talking about what a person values. And what I'm saying is what a person values guides their action. So, how, in that sense, how would you define value?
Uh, wait, I define value as what is worth caring about.
I would say that well, it can't be worth because worth is not that's an objective term. What something has worth. We're talking about the subjective sense where a person values something. So it doesn't
Oh,
have
sorry.
to be
Okay.
worth caring about.
Sorry. We're talking about. Okay. Sorry. I thought you were asking. Yeah. So I thought you were asking about what it means for something to be valuable, not to be
No, but
valued.
you're talking about
So
Mongolia, and so I'm
yeah,
saying.
right.
So what
Sure.
does value
Yeah.
mean in that
So
sense?
value in that sense of like the sense that we would talk about when I would say I value the end of famine in Mongolia. I don't actually know if there is famine in Mongolia, but there has to
Sure.
be at least a non-zero map. But so the sense in which I'm using the term value is just the things the value in that sense is the things that one cares about.
So the definition that I've always relied on, and I tend to go to the dictionary, and that's not always the best way, I grant it, but it normally is. These are words that have been in use for a lot of years, and they've been codified in, Webster's or Heritage Dictionary, Cambridge, Oxford, whatever, but they're in the dictionary. And dictionaries define value as, in this context, that which a person finds to be important, that which a person holds in high esteem, that sort of thing. And
Yeah,
I don't see how a person thinks that something is important because it means important. I find that it's important, right? But if I don't do anything about it, it's the saying from Emerson that what you are speaks so loud, I don't care what you're saying, right? You can tell me you value all kinds of things, but if you're not doing anything about it, then I don't see how you value it. Not in the sense of it's important to you.
well, no, things can be important to you even if you can't do it, even if you don't do anything about it. I mean, the Mongolia example shows it. I value people in
Oh,
Mongolia
it shows
having
that
good
you're
lives,
claiming to. It
even
doesn't
though.
show you do. It shows you're
Wait,
claiming to value them.
so your claim is that I don't value people in Mongolia's
Well,
lives at all?
well, I don't know what you really value. I'm saying for the hypothetical situation that the example you're giving, if I claim to value the lives of people in Mongolia and I'm not doing anything about it, then no, I don't really value it. I'm
Well,
just
that
saying
seems
I do.
well, that seems obviously wrong. Like it seems like there can be things that you value that you think are important, even if you're not acting to do anything. I mean, here's one example to show this. I mean, let's imagine that you were basically, you had locked-in syndrome, so you couldn't move, you couldn't really do
Yes.
anything, couldn't even speak. Would
Yes.
that mean there was nothing that you valued? No, it would just mean that you don't have the ability to act. Acting may often be a reliable guide to
Yeah.
informing us of what someone values, but acting and value are are not the same thing, and you don't have to act in a particular way to value something.
Okay. The example you just gave of locked-in syndrome. A person in locked-in syndrome is not physically capable of taking an action, right? So that person, if that person values something, that person is going to wish he could do, or she could do something about it. So it's a different scenario than when you are capable of taking an action and when the person is physically barred from doing anything, because that person might have a whole slew of values prior to going and becoming in locked-in syndrome that person takes action. So like for instance, he might take his kids to the park every Saturday, really values it. But now he's physically barred from doing it. Doesn't mean he doesn't value it anymore. It means he's absolutely prevented from doing so.
Okay.
But the second he can, he will.
Okay, consider another case. Suppose that I have to make a choice between saving one of two people,
Sure.
James and John.
Sure.
And so I have to save one of them. Before this, I didn't know anything about them, and so I look into both of their lives. I start caring a ton about them. I read a ton about them. I'm so sad that I have to bring about the deaths of one of them.
Okay.
Or that I can only save one of them, and so I end up saving James. Would that mean that because I don't do anything to show that I value John, that I don't value John at all? No, it would just mean that by the circumstances that there are other things that I value more.
Yes.
And I took actions on those other things that I value more.
Absolutely. You would, in that case, you would value, I forgot which one you saved, but whichever one you saved, you valued more. So when you're that's what I mean by it's more important to you. So out of the whole scale of things in life that you value, the situation of Mongolia, if you're not doing anything about it, is like at the bottom of your list.
Well, I don't think that's true. Like, I mean, it can be the case that you value something a lot, but there just isn't much you can do about it, right? Like, it turns out that it's not hard to save people's lives. If you donate a few $1,000s to charities like the Against Malaria Foundation, you can save a person's life. If it turned out there was a cheaper way to save people in Mongolia than to save people in a lot of the countries that they operate in, many of which are in Asia and Africa, then I would save the people in Mongolia. But I don't, because it's less effective. And so it's not that I value people in Mongolia any less than I value people in the countries that are being helped by the Against Malaria Foundation. It's just that it turns out that there are different actions have different amounts of effectiveness.
Yes.
And so it's not a difference in value. In terms of the John James example, well, in that case, so I agree that if you are deciding between two actions, between actualizing two states of affairs, and you choose to actualize one rather than the other, then the one that you choose to actualize is the one you value more. Okay, but that doesn't mean that what you claimed is that if you don't act to bring about some state of affairs, to promote something, then you don't value it. And my claim is that's false. In the case of John's life, you're not doing anything to show that you care about John's life. You're not doing anything to help John. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean you don't value John. It just means you value James more.
In that position, I forget which one's which, but in that position, though, you're in a situation where you can't do anything. It's by definition, by the example you gave, you could only save one of them, right? So you can't act on that value. So it's a different story when you can. It's like the locked-in syndrome. That person can't do anything. In the Mongolia example, you altered the scenario slightly by saying that your actions are going to be ineffective. So in that case, you would say, okay, I'm valuing more the chance to be effective than less effective. All things considered, all dynamics factored in, you're choosing the thing that you value more, which only demonstrates exactly what I'm saying, that values are impetuses to actions. It doesn't mean that every second of the day you have to act on every single value you have. That would be an impossibility. But if you never have any inclination to act, to do something, and even if you can, I would say you don't value it. But I
Well,
gotta,
yeah.
go
Wait,
ahead. I'm sorry. No,
let
you
me
can
let
continue.
me just
Yeah.
yeah. So I would agree with that. I think that if you value something, then if all else is equal, you will act to promote it, right? But but I mean, but there are going to be lots of things that you value that you're not doing anything about. So if I don't do anything about any problems facing Mongolia, that doesn't mean that I don't value the people in Mongolia. But if I wouldn't do anything about Mongolia, even if given the opportunity to help them, then that would show that I wouldn't value Mongolia. And so if you value something, then that means that if all else is equal, then you'll try to promote the things that you value. But it doesn't mean that you'll necessarily promote it all things considered, because all else is very often not equal.
Yeah, and whatever you happen to choose, all factors considered, is what you value the most at any given instant. In the instant, I'm not saying in totality. So right, if
yeah,
you
I
don't,
think that's true.
so but the question, and this is what happens with these philosophy discussions, is that there's so many dynamics in play that we often go, because my initial thing was I wanted you to validate the utilitarianism. So what I wanted to ask you was, what is in your mind the purpose of morality? Not the definition, the purpose.
Well, I mean, if it is objectively the case that you should do the right thing, and so the purpose of morality is to help point you towards what the right thing is, so you can do it.
So you can
Just
actually
like
live a moral life, right?
yes, like it's objectively right for you to do the right thing, and so the purpose of
Okay.
morality is to increase the odds that you objectively do the right thing.
Okay. The hedonic calculus, right? The thing where I have to act, that every act should be dictated by what is going to bring about the most well-being or the most pleasure, the most happiness, however you want to state it, right? Including that of lesser animals. I just say lesser because I don't have a better term for it, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah,
Non-human
sure.
animals, right? So how could I possibly, especially in the absence of rules, how could I possibly know when I'm going to act, when I'm going to pick up the mouse, right? Or anything that I'm going to do today? How could I possibly know what is going to bring about the most pleasure and the least pain in the universe?
Well, you can think about it, and then you can think about what the effects your actions will have. So I mean, like here's an obvious example. Suppose I decided to like jam a screwdriver into people's eyes. Well, that would make their life worse, would not produce benefits, so you shouldn't do it. There are going to be difficult cases. There are going to be cases where it's actually not clear what will bring about the most utility. But that's also a problem that plagues egoism. It's very often not clear what will end up being best for you. It's not clear what college you should pick.
It doesn't plague the objectivist ethics, not even a little bit. Not even a little bit. And I'll tell
Do
you,
you
and
want to
the
explain
reason
why?
I will, because the objectivist ethics holds that you should live by principles, that you don't live based on the act in the immediate moment. That is not that sort of short range pragmatism isn't around. So that,
Oh
for
yeah,
instance, honesty is held to be a virtue. Always contextually, of course. So I'm not going to tell the truth to the Nazis that are banging on the door while I'm Jewish, but you get my drift. That when they're going to kill somebody, or when a slave owner is chasing down a slave, honesty, the value is contextual, but the principle of honesty nevertheless is accurate. So if somebody says to me, well, you know what, right now you can have a big score, you can rob a bank, you're going to get away with it, and you're going to have these millions of dollars, or you just have to commit a fraud on the bank, rather, because I'm dealing with honesty. I would apply the principle of honesty. I don't have to calculate that particular act to say, is that act going to actually benefit me? Because I know that by going against the principle of honesty, it's going to be to my detriment. Because by that point, I'm throwing the principle out. I'm not going to have it to guide me any longer. And that way of living is going to harm me. So I
yeah,
don't.
no, I mean that's perfectly consistent with utilitarianism. So just the distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, that rule utilitarianism says you should act in ways according to the rules that if everyone followed them, they would
Yep.
make things go best. Well, the
Okay.
act utilitarian just says you should act in the best ways. Now, it turns out that if you want to act in the best way, it makes sense, given that it's very difficult to figure out when you're taking any particular action what its consequences will be. It makes sense to act by a few kind of broad rules. And so I agree that in your daily life, you should mostly like not be doing granular utility calculus. You should not, if you're deciding whether or not to lie to someone, you shouldn't like be like, well, working at utilitarian math, you just shouldn't lie because lying will tend to produce bad outcomes.
Okay. So
And
what
I
are the
think,
principles of utilitarianism?
well, I mean, so there are going to be different ones. Like, it would say in general, you should be honest unless you have a really, really good reason to lie. You should, be charitable. You should be nice to people. Like just sort of the basic virtues that people agree you should adopt are, I think, what utilitarianism would say to adopt. Now, I mean, utilitarianism is also going to say other things. So, for example, it's going to say that it's very important that you donate to charity. It's going to say that it's very important that you, don't eat meat because most animals live horrifying, tortured existences, or at least don't eat most meat. It's going to say that if you use your career to try to do a lot of good, that's really important because there are lots of careers where you can do a lot of good. But I think basically most of the kind of basic virtues that utilitarianism tells you to follow are things that utilitarianism will agree with common sense on. Can I just go back to an earlier point that was made briefly that we got slightly sidetracked on?
Yeah, go ahead.
So when I made the objection to egoism, where I gave the argument that was egoism would imply that if preventing 1 billion people from being tortured was at slight net personal cost, you shouldn't do it, but you obviously should do it. Therefore, it's wrong. You sort of objected, and you said that, well, that's a conclusion. That's not a premise. Well, no, I think it is a premise. Like, imagine you had some moral theory that said you should go around torturing people. You wouldn't need some other argument for why you shouldn't go around torturing people. The fact that a moral theory instructs you to go around torturing people means that it's wrong, because you obviously shouldn't go around torturing people.
Okay.
I think in a similar way,
should you torture people if it could prevent a lot of pain? If you could torture me and save 1 billion lives, should you do it?
Yes.
Well, okay, so there you go. You're going around torturing people.
Look,
I mean, you're torturing one person.
Yeah, well, so I was describing a scenario, like I was talking about an ethical theory that just says you should go around like torturing people willy-nilly. You wouldn't need a further argument for why that is wrong. In a similar way, you don't need a further argument.
What about to an ethical relativist who said there's no such thing as right and wrong?
Well, to an ethical relativist, like any argument is going to have to appeal to premises. And there are no premises that you can appeal to arguing against ethical relativism that are more obvious than the premise it's wrong to go around torturing people. Like I think a lot of people have this idea that the way you should do ethics is you should start with some principle. So first you figure out what the fundamental ethical principle is, and then you just apply this to all cases.
Okay.
And I think that's sometimes right. Like if there's an ethical theory that you think is right, you should apply it to cases where you're not sure about what to do. But if you're arguing with someone who you disagree with, I'm more confident that you shouldn't go around torturing people for no reason than I am in utilitarianism, because that premise is more obvious than any premise that features in a utilitarian argument. And so these middle level principles, if you're debating between two theories, that's how you should go about comparing them. You should compare their verdicts across cases.
Okay. Here's my question. On one hand, you just said that that's a premise that you're relying on. Then you said that you shouldn't have to rely on premises in ethics. And
wait, when did I say that?
Maybe I misunderstood. You just said that you said people tend to think that there has to be some premise that you apply to all your actions that determines the
No. I said what people think is that what you do is first you figure out the moral theory, and then what you do when you're reasoning about ethics is you just say, okay, what does this moral theory say about these cases? I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think that the right way to do it is you reflect on a lot of different cases, and then you see which moral theory ends up having the most plausible judgments about those cases, and then you lean towards that moral theory based on the fact that it ends up being the most intuitive across lots of cases. You don't like start from some top-down principle, reason about it from first principles, especially because all the proofs from first principles that don't make that don't have non-moral premises are all wrong. So instead of that, you just kind of You reflect about lots of cases, and then you see which moral theory is right. And I think it's very often going to be non-obvious which moral theory is right. Like, it actually turns out to require, I think, an extraordinary amount of thinking to realize that utilitarianism beats the other theories.
But but Matthew, you're saying that it beats the other theories, but it's beating the other theories based on your intuition.
Well, no, not just based on my intuition. Like, I mean, it's not just based on my intuition. I think it's based, if when we reflect on all the arguments, on all the judgments across lots of cases, I think that it will end up being most intuitive according to most people's intuitions when you combine it with, various arguments for it and the various reasons to discount particular intuitions. So, like, there are various intuitions that people will often appeal to, that I think we shouldn't trust very much, and we can give arguments for that. So I think utilitarianism ends up being, the best account. But I think that the wrong moral methodology is to say, okay, first let's figure out what the right account is of all of morality, and then let's reason about cases. Instead, you should reason about cases, and you don't need a general theory in order to reason about cases. You don't need to have figured out what the objective moral standard is to know that it's wrong to go around torturing people senselessly.
Okay, and that is still an assertion that's unproven. You're just saying you don't have to prove it.
Well, that it's wrong. I mean, so any proof is going to involve appealing to premises, right? For the argument. And any premise that you give is going to be less obvious than the premise that it's wrong to senselessly torture people.
Less
no
obvious
reason.
to whom?
To nearly all people. Like, there are going to be some people who don't have the right set of intuitions, just as there are going to be some people who are incapable of grasping various mathematical proofs, people who, are not going to be able to grasp various things. But I mean, I think, we should generally care more about the intuitions of people who are smarter, who have thought more about philosophy, who are more rational.
So, but into what? Okay, so it's just basically so it's not even appealing to the majority intuitions. It's appealing to the majority of intuitions of people that are intelligent. And how do we judge that they're intelligent? Because their intuitions are giving us the right conclusions. How do we judge the right conclusions? Because of their intuitions.
No, that's not how we judge who's intelligent.
How do we judge it?
Well, there are lots of ways of judging intelligence. I mean, here's one way. Have them take an IQ test.
Okay. Have them take an IQ test. And how are they completing this IQ test? What makes the IQ test right? Are we relying on intuitions to judge the IQ test, to judge the effectiveness of an IQ test?
We rely on a scoring metric for the IQ test. The same. I'm saying, like, if you want to figure out whose intuitions to trust, you should look at various things. One of them is whether people have been studying philosophy a lot. One of them is whether, they have lots of published papers such that, it seems like they're pretty good at philosophy. They're able to reason about it. They're able to argue about it competently. One of them is if they're smart. You should trust smart people to reason about things more than dumb people if all else is equal.
Well, you didn't say to reason. You said you should trust their intuitions. There's a big difference. There's a difference between trusting smart people's reasoning and trusting smart people's intuitions. And as far as people that study philosophy, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche both studied philosophy. So did Heidegger. And these people are not coming to the same conclusions you are by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I agree that they're not coming. I mean, I think they have various methodological flaws. My claim is not that all people who study philosophy will necessarily come to the right conclusions. My claim is that we should rely on intuitions, and in determining whose intuitions we should trust people for whom we have outside reason to think that their intuitions are likely to be right. This will include people who are very intelligent. This will include people who are pretty good at philosophy, who have lots of published papers, lots of citations, who can argue for their points well, etc.
Well, I just read something this morning where you said somebody's ability to argue a point doesn't necessarily matter. I just read it in your blog this morning.
Well, what I said was that if you can out-argue the average person on a point, that doesn't give you any reason to think it's correct, given that it's easy to out-argue the average person on nearly all points, because the average person has not thought very much about very many issues, and the average person isn't very smart. However, if every time utilitarians argue with deontologists, they always win the arguments, that would give some reason to think utilitarianism is right and deontology is wrong, because if all else is equal, then better arguments will generally beat worse arguments.
Matthew, how could the average person assess who won that debate?
Well, they think about the arguments on both sides, and
but the average person is just average.
Who seems to have better arguments.
So, I mean, how can we trust the average person's conclusions? We can't trust their intuitions. They're not that smart. We have to trust the
Well,
smart
no,
people, but how can they assess the smart people?
we can trust their intuitions to some degree.
Oh,
And we can trust, they can rely on outside judgments. So if, for example, like I don't know any mathematics. Well, no, I mean that's obviously wrong. I know some mathematics, but I'm not great at math. I sort of,
me neither.
calculus was kind of rough. But I can still figure out, like, there's still ways that I can figure out who is likely to be the best mathematicians of our age. So, for example, I have very good reason to think that von Neumann was a very impressive mathematician. One reason for this is that if you look at what his contemporaries said, they all agreed he was an impressive mathematician. One reason is that he was very obviously very smart. He was able to, he could quote books word for word, entire pages of books that he'd read 30 years prior. He was obviously a very smart guy. In a similar way, if intuitions are intellectual appearances, it's sort of your intellect attempting to grasp some part of the moral reality, then if people are more, have a more impressive intellect, then they're more likely to be able to grasp the moral reality.
That's fine, but that's not fine for the average person. The average person isn't studying philosophy. The average person doesn't know who von Neumann is. I certainly didn't. The average person hasn't read Critique of Pure Reason. They haven't read the Utilitarianism or On Liberty by Mill. They're just the average person. So how are they ever going to have any ethical guidance?
Well, I think the average person should basically I think if you haven't studied a domain at all, what you should do is you should basically take a poll of the people who have studied the domain and have your views be kind of roughly pluralist among those views. If you
Okay.
haven't studied, if you haven't studied philosophy at all, you should probably just assume that what most philosophers agree is right, which is going to be some kind of like watered down moderate ontology.
So it wouldn't be
No, I don't think that is right.
utilitarianism. It wouldn't be
No,
utilitarianism then.
right. I agree that the average person who has not studied philosophy, like there are going to be lots of cases where what a person is justified in believing is not what's true. So, it could be the case, I'm justified in believing that Fermat's last theorem is true because, mathematicians say it's true. And this is so
Okay.
even if I have not checked the proof.
Yeah.
So even if the proof turned out to be wrong, I would still be justified in thinking Fermat's last theorem is true. In a similar way, it could be that, it's going to be the case that because most people should sort of just Mike Humer has a good paper on this called is critical thinking epistemically responsible? And the basic point is no, it isn't. Instead of thinking critically about issues, unless you have a lot of time to dedicate to it, you can sort of think about it a lot and you're kind of a smart person, you generally should just defer to what smarter people than you say.
Okay. So to wrap up, let me just make sure I got this right. You're saying that under your standard, the majority of people are not going to accept your ethical view.
Yeah, I think most people
If
would not
people,
be
what I mean is,
justified.
if people take your guidance, then they're not going to end up being moral people. They're going to end up being immoral people.
Well, I think being a moral person comes in degrees. And I don't think that being a moral person is about having the right ethical theory. So, there are lots of people who I would consider good people who are not utilitarians.
Okay.
But I mean, let me just give you, this sort of sounds weird if you say it, but let me give you an example. So let's imagine that I am some mathematician and I have a
Okay.
kind of heterodox view. I think, that, something is false. And I think I have really good arguments for it. But, I haven't yet been able to convince most mathematicians. Just most mathematicians haven't looked over my arguments, haven't looked over my proofs. I would say that, if only 0.5% of mathematicians believe something, most people who don't understand the mathematics, they shouldn't believe me. They should believe what most mathematicians say, even if I think that I'm right. Sometimes, if you don't have the ability to evaluate complicated arguments, you should agree with what most experts say rather than what you in particular.
Okay. Well, Matthew, thank you very much for being with us. Is there anything that you need to say that I didn't let you get in? I don't want to have you leave the show without making your point.
No, yeah, I was able to make all the points.
And
Thanks for
where can
having me.
people find you? That's important too.
People can, so I have a YouTube channel called The Liberation Under Ideal Conditions. And then I also have a blog at bentham.substack.com. I think that the blog is better than the YouTube channel, but I mean, both worth checking out.
Awesome. And Matthew is actually going to interview me for his show, so you'll be able to watch that also. He'll be interviewing me about my theory of ethics that I adhere to. Thank everybody for joining us. Thanks to Matthew. For now, this is the Rational Egoist, Michael Leibowitz signing off. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe.